And so as I was listening to all of our presenters who are going to be coming up here on stage as they bring the chairs out, is I was thinking about my son. And I know many of us think about our families and our communities. And my son, when he was about 12 years old, he's about to turn 17. I know I look way too young, but he's almost 17. When he was about 12 years old, he was playing in a basketball league. So how many people here know Indian basketball is a big deal? Big deal. All our kids play it. We all go. Our refs have bigger medallions than you've ever seen out on a basketball court. The thing about my son, he was playing in an urban Indian league, and they'd go travel to the different reservations. And the woman who runs the program, an Oglala Lakota woman, Sarah Since Wilson, has dedicated her life to our urban Indian youth. And one of the things she does is she makes sure that all the kids in the Seattle community are included. So one time, my son had one of the kids over with him, and they were playing video games, and I saw when the kid walked out the door, he was carrying a pair of my son's favorite basketball shoes. So basketball shoes to teenage boys, big deal. And these were the shoes that my cousin Bunky Ekowak had actually designed for Nike. And so they're one of a kind, couldn't get them anywhere else. And when I came back from dropping off his friend, one of the kids he played basketball with, I asked him, I said, Miguel, I saw Eric walked out with your shoes. Like, why does he have your shoes? And he told me, he said, Mom, do you know that Eric only has one pair of shoes? He's like, I've got like 7. He said, do you know that Eric lives in a group home? And I said, yeah, I did know Eric lives in a group home. And he said, well, I have lots of shoes. So I gave him those ones. And when I think about it, I want to take all the credit and be the world's best parent. But I know the teachings that my son received in that basketball program, where the elders that Sarah brought in to share wisdom with them before they started, was the food that they fed them, was the language classes that were part of it. And so when it comes to evaluating our programs and the impact culturally based programming has on our youth, it's when our children give the best that they have so that others around them are able to experience and have better lives. So how do we, as native practitioners of public health, of evaluation, of research, ensure that those kinds of things that somebody outside of our community may not have known to ask, how does the impact of elders coming in and spending 30 minutes with you before you play basketball? Those are the kind of things, as we think about what Dr. Warren talked about, what our friend from New Zealand, Miss Goodwin, talked about, what Miss Odom talked about. Those are the impacts that we want to discuss, and the questions that you all ask is, how do we incorporate these culturally based ways of knowing and being? Stories as indicators, evaluation as a cultural framework we've always had. So I'm going to start today by going to our first panelist. And so if we want to put up the first question for Dr. Don Warren. So, Dr. Warren, do you ever struggle with approaching tobacco use as a tool and or medicine versus an addictive use of tobacco?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to distinguish between commercial tobacco and traditional tobacco, two very, very different things. And in Lakota, we call tobacco chinchasha, and it's a blending of herbs, mainly red willow, and it's a medicinal herb. It's actually good for us. But the problem is that we use commercial tobacco quite often in our ceremonies. I know people even use cigarette tobacco in their pipe when they pray. And that is a struggle, because we're trying to do something that is sacred and that is ceremonial and it's prayer, but we're using a poison if we're using commercial tobacco. So one of the truths that we have to confront is that we have adopted a poison and called it traditional. And would our ancestors be proud of us? Is that doing something honorable? So these are difficult things. And I have uncles who are traditional healers, and they grew up in a community where the vast majority of adults smoke. So I have uncles who are medicine men, but also smoke cigarettes. And in many ways are dependent because of the addictive nature of nicotine. But I always tease my uncles that we never used to chain smoke the sacred pipe. Not what we did. It was only for prayer. So that's a struggle in terms of making sure that we're not using commercial tobacco in traditional settings, but that does occur. But what I've seen also is that there's a movement toward Kinshasa-only ceremonies where we're not bringing in cigarette tobacco. So that's the struggle, is getting the cigarette tobacco out of the ceremony.
Thank you so much. So on to our next panelist. So if we could have the question for Ms. Sharon Odom. How do we get the big funders to understand we need to be able to apply for funding not only to address our deficits, but to support our strengths?
Okay. And it's an ongoing question. You know, we have a lot of discussion over this. I even have some colleagues that tell me when they get to Washington, that's all they want to hear. They want to hear about how poor off we are. But it's important that we continue to tell our stories, even in grant writing, so we can say, you know, we have to acknowledge what the deficits are, but our solutions are in our cultural knowledge and in our traditions, and we have to put those out front, that yes, we have this, and the way that we're going to get to overcome this is by using our stories and our culture and our traditions and our knowledge, and we're going to do all of that. We have to keep putting our strengths out there, and it needs to be a part of what we're writing in the grant. We have to tell them what they are and exactly how we're going to go about to do that. We struggle with that question all the time, but I think it's important that we all talk about what our strengths are in everything that we do.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say, you know, as the Urban Indian Health Institute, the organization that I direct, we're the National Evaluation Center for Good Health and Wellness in Indian Country, otherwise known as GWIC, and I know there are some grantees here. And we have seen some federal funding opportunities coming out that do have a strength-based approach, and I think what you're talking about, putting it in our grants, writing it in our papers, our presentations, is really, we've seen some change happening. So if we want to go to the question for Ms. Goodwin. So it seems like there are more Indigenous academics in New Zealand than in the US. Is this true? And if so, why? And what can we learn about this from you?
I don't know how I could answer that. I actually wouldn't know, but there do seem to be, there is a lot of, over many years now, 20, 30 years, you know, discussion about kaupapa Māori research, in particular, theory and research, and interestingly, they are actually trying to support more of us as PhD students, master's students to come through and continue to develop the work that people like Linda Smith, Graham Smith have actually, you know, developed many years ago, and to move it forward even more. But I couldn't make a comparison. I wouldn't know.
So I was recently in New Zealand and had the opportunity to speak at the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, and one of the things they shared, and I can't remember the name of the program, I will find it and put it into the comments of this question, but there was an initiative to graduate 500 Maori PhDs.
Right. Yes.
And, I'm sorry? Oh, they passed it. So yes, put it in the comments there. That's incredible. And so it's always exciting. When I was there, I was sitting in this room, it's like, oh my gosh, everybody here has a PhD or is getting a PhD. So I love that question. And it's good to hear that more than 500, that's incredible. There's a lot that we can learn, so thank you for sharing. So if we want to go to the next question, and also if you look on the pigeonhole, there is a question that you can ask of all the panelists, and I see one here for everyone. Are there international efforts for Indigenous cultures to share information?
I can go first, but yeah, there are. It's wonderful to see. There's, for example, the International Diabetes Federation has a biennial conference. It's coming up again this year, and they have an Indigenous stream, and there are presenters who are American Indian, Alaska Native, Maori, Aboriginal from Australia, Native Hawaiian, First Nations from Canada who come together. So I know around diabetes there's a lot of work in that area, but I know through research organizations as well there's some programs.
I think there's certainly some exchanges that happen from New Zealand between Indigenous cultures and other countries through academia and universities. We have a number of Indigenous universities in New Zealand, and I'm part of a small Māori evaluation association that's just been started in the last year or two, but very small, but there are a number of these happening and kind of connecting to other evaluation societies across the world. So I'm not sure how much more there is, but they're really coming to the fore now, I think, aren't they?
I know for us that among the Pacific Islanders, there's a lot more sharing of information. And I think Hawaii or the places that we go, there's definitely conferences and things. I just came back from Canada 2 weeks ago, and I was part of a Wisdom Keeper and Indigenous women's camp. And so there was a lot of sharing. But it often comes down to funding, too, and how do we fund all of these different groups to be in one place or to share information, especially when they're not like technologically savvy and they don't have all of the equipment. How do we continue to get the information across all of the populations? It's a good question.
So there is, for those who are interested, the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Networks. There's 3, one in New Zealand, one in Australia, and one in the United States. You're welcome to join the one in the United States as a member and follow the work that we're doing. And it really talks about, it's one of those international efforts to talk about, as Indigenous peoples, we have the right to govern and influence all information collected about us through evaluation and through research. So that is one international thing that is going on right now, and of course could use lots of money. So if there's anybody out there, I'm sure I can find you somebody who could use the money. So next question. So to Dr. Warren, do you think that Indigenous evaluation frameworks are an improvement over Western academic frameworks in non-Native settings? And I'd actually like to ask this across the panel from your different experiences with Maori people and then with Native Hawaiians.
I think in some settings it would be, but not in every setting. I think that the challenge with evaluating public health programs is that it occurs in a context. There's a social context, a cultural context, a community context, a historical context. It's not like basic science where you're controlling everything in a test tube or a petri dish. You know, there's so many things that are not controlled for in community settings. So I think that the big value that we bring to evaluation frameworks is an understanding of that. And I've seen in my own experience colleagues trying to impose a scientific Western modern perspective on communities, whether it fits or not. So I think that from an Indigenous perspective, we understood that round pegs don't fit in square holes. And that's been a struggle, I think. Honestly, some of my colleagues in high levels of scientific arenas have had a challenge with understanding differences across cultures and communities and don't understand the depth of impact that has. So I think it is, and I think it would be of great assistance in a number of communities, particularly culturally diverse communities and underserved populations.
I guess we could try and colonise Western world with Indigenous frameworks. But yeah, I agree too that it's very context specific and it is what it is. It's an Indigenous framework for an Indigenous setting. Yeah.
My first answer would be to say yes, but I can understand that I need to step back and really think about it. I don't work in that many non-Indigenous communities, so I don't know. But what I do know is that our Indigenous cultural values seem to be universal values of care and wisdom and knowledge, and that we've seen components of our programs work across many different cultures, and because they're basic human core values that come from just an Indigenous of mindset. But I feel like that we have a lot to offer the Western framework of programming.
Absolutely. To Sharon, are you able to use your Indigenous framework for evaluation in your programs to establish success for grant applications?
Oh, absolutely.
Great question.
Yeah, we take the different components that we talked about and we tell our stories, or we have numbers for things, and we take all of that kind of data. But we've also, within our local granting communities, been able to shift the way that they're looking. And actually, like I was showing for HMSA, SNAPHED has recently come to talk to me, and so they're trying to, after we've been talking about our successes through that framework, about actually using some of that framework in the grant application. So that's on a local level. The federal level is, a little bit harder. And, I had one lady from the mainland come and look at our gardening program, and she goes, all you guys are doing is talking about culture and passing down stories. That's not approved curriculum. And it's like, oh my gosh, okay, so what do you do with them? But we definitely have been able to use our framework to all speak the same language and to look for certain stories and to look for certain success components, and then use that in the grant to show why our cultural, our knowledge and our programming could work, and to apply for money.
Do any of the other panelists have any thoughts about this question? But how do we get those strength-based grants written and accepted by funders, philanthropy?
In my own experience, I've had more success with philanthropic organizations than I have with federal funding. And I think quite often the people who write the request for proposals are not the same people doing the scientific review. And quite often the scientific review doesn't match the cultural frameworks that are in the RFP. So we're getting better at writing requests for proposals. I haven't seen that same degree of success in reviewing grants at the federal level. But the philanthropic organizations, I think, are a little bit ahead.
I think a positive recent example in New Zealand from a strength-based perspective within policy would be the whānau order policy, like whānau wellbeing or family wellbeing policy, which has had significant funding throughout New Zealand to support what we call whānau order, but in a different way than it has been, in a much more strength-based way than it has been in the past, and looking at family as collectives as well rather than the individual.
Thank you. We go to another question. How do we build evidence-based practices across tribal communities when there's a barrier to data, even within tribes? Great question. It's to everyone.
Well, I think that is a big challenge. And I think that what we have to recognize is that we can build evidence-based practices within tribal communities, and then those practices could then be modified for other tribes. The challenge is, particularly in the U.S. with our tribal nations, the governance structures are so much more complicated than they are in other parts of the indigenous world. But with tribal sovereignty, with an Indian Health Service, which is federally operated, tribally operated programs, state-operated Medicaid systems, CDC data sets, IHS data sets, tribal data sets, state data sets. It gets incredibly complex, but I think if we can show successful programming that overcomes some of the data coordination challenges, then that in and of itself is an evidence-based practice on how to overcome some of the data integration challenges.
I think as evaluators we struggle with this all the time. Like, we want to build capacity within providers to collect their own data and be able to tell their own stories, but often they're too busy to do that, or the time factor. But I think if we can build capacity within community providers and tribal providers to do their own data and understand the importance of it, or what it can do for them, that is really helpful. And the example I shared in my presentation was a really good example of how providers came on board because it was fairly simplified what they had to do in the end, but it actually created a commitment to evaluation and they could see how it could work for them. So, yeah, I think we can do more.
I think our approach is that if we... a lot of times there's a resistance or defensiveness to data, and I have to remind everyone that we're working with that our kupuna, our ancestors, were evaluators in everything they did. They assessed everything they did. If they were teaching you, there was a constant assessment of how you were moving, how you were progressing, what you needed, what you didn't have. And so assessment and evaluation is something that we always did. It's just this Western data framework that we tend to be very resistant again. And in our evaluation, there are some things that we have decided as a group that we're just never going to ask. You're never going to get that answer from us. But there's also a lot of ways that we can contribute to knowledge, but we never ask an evaluation question that's not going to do any good for us and the person we're asking a question. So you don't get to come into my program and say, what is your highest level of education in this, high school, college, advanced degree? Because I don't even want anyone to feel bad that they don't have a college or an advanced degree, especially if they're a practitioner, especially if they're a kupuna. And so we often put into our grants, I have both an external evaluator and an internal evaluator on many of my grants because I think evaluation is really important, but I'm really intentional about what data I collect, how I collect it, and protecting the people that I collect the data from.
So kind of a follow-up to this question would be, how do we build that internal evaluation capacity? What are some of the resources, what are some of the programs that you've seen that have created that capacity for us to do, such as your program is doing for ourselves?
Some of the funding agencies are actually building evaluation as a requirement in the budget, which is wonderful. A lot of HRSA grants, for example, you have to have an evaluator, and you have to have an evaluation plan on the front end. And some of our larger scale research center grants also have evaluation components. So it's starting to get built into the request for proposals, I think, in a more formal way. The challenge then is one more potential barrier for tribal organizations or tribes to get their own research funding if we don't have that infrastructure in place. So what I would hope to see is that as more of us get educated in public health and in program evaluation, that hopefully we'll see our people working with our tribal communities to build those capacities. But honestly, we're not there yet in many of our communities. Some are doing this very well, but others have a long way to go to build the infrastructure.
Any other thoughts? I think we're at 5 minutes left or so. Just about 5 minutes. So if you all have any closing comments or thoughts before we close out the session, I'm going to give you that opportunity now.
There's a couple things. In talking about kind of the differences in approach from purely scientific and purely indigenous and recognizing there's connectivities, but there are cultural differences. I remember I used to work with the National Institutes of Health. I was a staff clinician, and we were doing diabetes research in the Southwest. And one of the tribes in Arizona, they were identifying higher rates of kidney failure, and sometimes people presenting with kidney failure, not even knowing they had diabetes. It was just a horrible circumstance. And I was talking to my supervisor at NIH, and the first thing I was thinking about was, my own family members with diabetes and the aunties and the grandfathers and grandmothers and the people that are genuinely suffering through this experience. And I remember my supervisor said, I would love to mine that data. That was his perspective, is I would love to mine that data. No feel for the people who are suffering, no compassion for the subjects he wanted to study. And that's when I think I had my first aha moment, is that the scientific community historically, I think, believes that it knows more than it does. And I think that in many ways, the scientific community has a long way to go to catch up to indigenous knowledge and understanding that we're doing this for people. This is about compassion. This is about working with human beings. And I think the framework historically, and maybe the bias historically, is that we can put a basic science framework onto public health research, and we just cannot. I mean, it's called basic science for a reason. It's very basic and easy relative to community-based work, but what we need is the community-based work. And we need more of our own people doing it, because I don't think we see each other simply as data sets.
Well, as a Māori evaluator, and I'm doing a PhD in this subject, I'm obviously very passionate about Indigenous evaluation, and I just think we just need, the more we can support Indigenous evaluation and Indigenous-led evaluation within our programs, the better we're going to be, because I think, we need to be able to do that for ourselves as well as provide the programs ourselves. So.
My basic thought is evaluation should only be done if it's beneficial to the person being evaluated, and that should be the underlying premise of all evaluation. But that being said, I feel like in our program, what we've learned is that having someone that can look at many different programs or different aspects of the program and to help to find a scope or find a pathway or find things for everyone to look at has been really helpful for us. And so working together as communities, as programs, or even within an organization to have someone that really understands evaluation from an Indigenous framework is really invaluable. And this is just off the subject, but I'm just going to say this really fast. There was a number of people that were interested in our cultural childbirth program. And so I have 3 of our staff here that's part of that program. And I'm going to try and find a time and put it on the board, maybe at lunch tomorrow. And so if anybody is interested in the cultural birthing aspect of our work, then I invite you to come join us.
Thank you. And I encourage all of you, as you see these amazing presenters walking through the halls, sitting in sessions at lunch, come ask for a card, ask some questions. The best part about being in these spaces is about connecting with each other and learning from the experiences of each other. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your experiences, for sharing your wisdom, and for giving us a lot to think about tonight. So thank you so much for being part of this panel.
Thank you.